It was supposed to be another normal night on Fox News, but no one knew they were about to witness a moment that would change everything. The tension in the studio was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. On one side, a Hollywood legend with 2 Oscars and a career spanning decades, Robert De Niro, who had never been afraid to speak his mind. On the other side, a 27-year-old political firebrand, Karoline Leavitt, who had just stepped into the spotlight as the White House press secretary. This wasn't just a debate. This was a showdown of epic proportions, and no one was prepared for what was about to unfold. De Niro, already on stage, his jaw set and eyes sharp, had just dropped a bombshell, calling Donald Trump the biggest disaster America has ever seen, and branding Leavitt his puppet, a mere mouthpiece with no real voice of her own. His words echoed through the studio, sending shockwaves across the room as the audience reacted in a frenzy, some applauding, others jeering. It was clear De Niro was not just here to criticize Trump. He was here to take down anyone who stood with him, including the rising star, Karoline Leavitt. As the audience's response died down, the spotlight shifted toward Leavitt. With a firm grip on the microphone, she stood tall, her eyes burning with resolve. For many, this was just another young political figure, part of the new wave of conservatives. But tonight, she wasn't just going to be a bystander in her own story. She had come to defend not just her reputation, but everything she believed in. De Niro thought he could dismantle her with his words. But what he didn't understand was that Leavitt wasn't just some inexperienced voice. She had been raised to fight for what she believed in, strong in her faith, her family values, and her loyalty to Trump. And this was her moment to prove that, far from being a puppet, she was a force to be reckoned with. The crowd grew silent as the camera zoomed in on her face. The challenge had been set, and Karoline Leavitt wasn't backing down. As the lights flared up on De Niro, his deep voice boomed through the studio. He wasn't just stating opinions, he was attacking, going straight for the jugular. "I'm here to say one thing," De Niro began, his confidence flowing from years of experience on both the silver screen and the public stage. "Donald Trump is the biggest disaster America has ever seen, and Karoline Leavitt is his newest puppet, a mouthpiece who knows nothing beyond reading the scripts Trump shoves in her hands." His voice echoed with certainty, as if these were indisputable facts. He wasn't just talking about politics, he was questioning her very integrity. The audience erupted into a frenzy, liberal supporters on one side cheering loudly, while MAGA supporters hissed in protest. But De Niro wasn't fazed. His smirk grew wider as he paced the stage, hands outstretched, his words almost theatrical. "You think I'm kidding?" he challenged. "I've seen guys like Trump, con men, all flash and no substance. I've played gangsters in movies, but Trump, he's the real deal." The crowd laughed, many nodding along, as De Niro, a Hollywood icon, wielded his star power like a weapon. And Karoline, well, she was the target of it all. "You think Leavitt has anything to stand on?" he continued, his eyes narrowing as he shifted his focus to the younger press secretary. "She's just a kid, 27 years old, hasn't lived enough to know what's really going on. Yet she dares to stand before the nation as a spokesperson for a clown. She's covering for him, covering for a man who's out of touch with America. I've seen it all, through decades of real-life experience, not in some cushy White House office. And now, here she is, playing Trump's puppet, reading from the script he hands her. If that's who represents America, we're in real trouble." The crowd burst into applause, the liberal side roaring in approval. Phones were raised high, and there was no mistaking that this moment would become a viral sensation. De Niro had delivered what he thought was a knockout punch, confident that his decades of experience would make Karoline Leavitt crumble before him. The stage was set, but what De Niro didn't know was that Karoline wasn't the type to fold under pressure. Not now, not ever. She could feel the weight of his words hanging in the air, the sting of each insult, each jab at her integrity and faith. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she gripped the mic tighter, her heart racing, but her resolve steely. She had prepared for this. She had come for a reason, not just to defend herself, but to show that her voice mattered. The spotlight was hers now, and she was about to use it to turn the tables. "You think you know me, Robert," Karoline would later say, "but you don't know a thing about who I am or what I stand for." She was ready to prove not just her worth, but to demonstrate that she was more than just a puppet, more than just the figurehead De Niro had painted her to be. This was her moment to take control of the stage, to show that she wasn't just some naive kid following orders. She was a woman of conviction, and no one was going to take that away from her. The atmosphere was electric, charged with the energy of the moment. Karoline knew the eyes of millions were on her. This wasn't just a political battle, it was a fight for her future, for her voice, for everything she believed in. And she wasn't going to let De Niro define her. She had come to redefine the conversation, to flip the script and steal the spotlight. It was time to show De Niro and everyone watching just how wrong he was. The stage had been set, and she was ready to rise to the challenge. The room crackled with tension as De Niro took a step back, still basking in the spotlight of his verbal assault. The audience seemed to hang on every word, some nodding, others laughing at his portrayal of Karoline as nothing more than a puppet, someone too young and inexperienced to understand the complexities of American politics. His smirk deepened as he soaked in the applause. For him, this was just another performance, another stage where he could wield his influence and make his opinions known. But what De Niro didn't realize, as the crowd continued to react, was that Karoline Leavitt wasn't the nervous rookie he thought she was. She wasn't going to cower in front of a Hollywood icon with decades of fame and accolades. She was a seasoned fighter in her own right. She had trained for moments like this, moments where she had to stand tall against the loudest voices in the room and show the world that she wasn't just a puppet. The audience's mixed reactions still echoed in her ears as she stood poised and unshaken, ready to make her move. Karoline's mind raced, her heart pounding as De Niro's words tried to sink in, but she didn't let them. She had a different plan, a plan that would not only challenge him but force him to confront the truth he had tried so hard to bury. His attack on her age, her faith, and her loyalty to Trump was supposed to rattle her, to weaken her resolve, but instead it only sharpened her focus. If De Niro thought he could use his Hollywood star power to take her down, he was sorely mistaken. She had come prepared. De Niro was the one who had underestimated her. He didn't know what she had in store. Karoline had watched countless political battles play out, and she knew this moment would be no different from the countless times her father and others had stood on the front lines, speaking truth to power. But this time, it was her turn. She had been quiet for long enough. Her fingers tightened around the microphone, and as the audience calmed, she began her response, her voice steady and calm, but filled with the unmistakable fire of someone who was no longer afraid to speak up. "Robert," she began, addressing him directly, not backing down for a second, "you've spent decades playing tough guys in movies, but you seem to forget that real life isn't a script." Her words rang out, sending a shockwave through the room, silencing the audience for a brief moment. She wasn't just talking about Hollywood. It was clear she was addressing De Niro's entire approach to life and politics, the way he believed that fame and status gave him an edge. But Karoline had one thing De Niro didn't, an understanding of what it truly meant to fight for something greater than yourself, to represent the people who had trusted her to be their voice. She continued, her eyes locked on his, not giving him an inch. "You stand there with your 2 Oscars and your decades of film history, but you've become a part of the very elite system that people like me are fighting against. You live in luxury, hobnob with the Hollywood crowd, while millions of Americans are struggling to make ends meet. You talk about being real, but all I see is a man out of touch with the people he claims to represent." The crowd could feel the shift in energy. The MAGA supporters, who had been on the defensive ever since De Niro's attack, erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the studio. They saw something in Karoline that resonated with them. She wasn't just defending her boss, she was defending the everyday American, the ones who felt forgotten by the elites that Niro represented. Leavitt didn't give him a chance to speak, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "You call me a puppet, say I don't understand what's going on. You think you know me because of my age, because of what you think you've seen in the media. You've spent your life acting like you understand the struggles of the working class, but you've never been one of them. You don't know what it's like to grow up in a middle-class home, fighting for your future." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I do. I know what it's like to fight for what's right, to stand up for the people who need a voice." The room was filled with applause, louder now, as Karoline's words struck a chord with the people who had tuned in to watch her, the ones who saw in her a reflection of their own struggles. The camera shifted briefly, but Karoline kept her focus locked on Niro. She wasn't just going to let him throw barbs at her. No, she was going to make him answer for every attack he had made. "You want to talk about failures, Robert?" she asked, a knowing smile creeping onto her lips. "Let's talk about your career. How many flops have you had in the last few years? How much money did The Irishman lose? $40 million? I think it's time we talk about who's really out of touch here." The room erupted into laughter, the sting of her words landing squarely on Niro's ego. He had been throwing stones at her, but Karoline had just picked up a few of her own. She wasn't afraid to call him out, not in front of millions, not when she had the facts to back up her words. Niro, visibly shaken by her response, opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to escape him. He tried to regroup, his face flushed with frustration, but Karoline wasn't going to give him the space. She had come too far, and she wasn't about to let this moment slip away. She pressed on, her voice rising with conviction. "You want to mock me for being loyal to Trump? You want to say I'm just a mouthpiece?" she asked. "I'm here because I believe in what we're doing. I believe in the strength of America, in the values that have built this country." She was on fire now, every word hitting with precision. "You can sit there and call me a puppet, but I know who I represent. I represent the people who have been left behind by Washington and Hollywood, the ones who are ready for change, ready for a new kind of leadership." The MAGA crowd stood up, their cheers deafening, the energy in the room swelling as Karoline continued to turn the tide. Niro was no longer the untouchable Hollywood legend. In that moment, he was the one on the defensive, trying to recover from a blow he hadn't seen coming. Karoline's eyes never left him as she finished her thought. "I'm 27, yes, but I've been working for this country since I was in college. I've fought for every person who believes in making America strong again, and I'm not going anywhere. The question is, Robert, are you—" The room broke into thunderous applause, the sound of victory echoing through the studio. Karoline Leavitt had just taken down Robert Niro, and she had done it with one simple truth. She wasn't the puppet, he was. The energy in the studio shifted dramatically as Karoline Leavitt took the stage. The noise from the crowd was deafening. MAGA supporters cheered passionately, while the liberal contingent threw their whistles and jeers into the mix. The spotlight seemed to follow her every move, casting a sharp glow on her determined face as she confidently made her way to the center. For a moment, it felt as if time had slowed down, and the eyes of millions watching from home were locked onto her every step. Karoline wasn't just walking out to defend herself. She was stepping into the arena to challenge the man who had tried to diminish her in front of the entire nation. The words Niro had thrown at her were still ringing in the air, but she wasn't there to shrink away from them. She was there to turn them around, to show that she wasn't just a passive participant in this conversation. She was the one in control. As she settled into her position, her gaze never left Niro. The seasoned actor, with his 2 Oscars and years of experience in Hollywood, was sitting across from her, arms crossed, still wearing the cocky smirk of a man who believed he had already won the battle. But Karoline knew that the real battle was just about to begin. The tension in the room reached a fever pitch as the stage fell silent. She stood tall, her voice cutting through the air with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "Mr. De Niro," Karoline began, her tone firm and direct, "I heard everything you just said, all the insults, the attacks, calling me a puppet, a clueless kid, someone who doesn't know what's going on. But let's get one thing straight. You've made a lot of assumptions about me, and I'm here to tell you that everything you think you know is wrong." The crowd held its breath, waiting for what came next. Karoline wasn't playing defense. She was going on the offensive. "You think you can stand there with all your Hollywood fame and humiliate me and President Trump in front of the nation? Well, you're wrong." She paused for a beat, letting her words sink in before delivering her first blow. "Let's start with your so-called gangster comparisons," she continued, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You say Trump is a gangster, but you, Robert, you've spent your career playing gangsters on the big screen, hiding behind characters who are tough, who intimidate. But real life isn't a movie. You want to call Trump a gangster. Maybe you should take a good look at yourself, because the only gangster I see is the one in front of me right now, pretending to be a tough guy when you're nothing but a relic of the past." The room was stunned into silence for a moment. De Niro, who had been so certain of his superiority just moments ago, now found himself on the back foot. Karoline's words had cut through his defense, and she wasn't done yet. With the crowd still buzzing, she pressed forward. "You talk about failure, but have you looked at yourself lately?" Karoline asked, her voice steady, almost too calm. "You've spent decades in Hollywood, living in luxury, making millions, but what has that really done for the American people? You've been out of touch for so long that you can't even see what's happening to the country you claim to care about." The MAGA supporters, who had been silent up until now, erupted in applause. Karoline's words had hit home. De Niro, the self-proclaimed spokesman for the people, had been exposed as just another member of the Hollywood elite, out of touch with the struggles of everyday Americans. Karoline's sharp tone softened slightly as she continued. "You mocked me for the signal leak, calling it a mistake. Fine, I'll admit it was a mistake. But you know what's worse than a mistake, Mr. De Niro? Living in a bubble of privilege, where you're so far removed from reality that you can't see the damage you're causing with every word you speak. You can attack me all you want, but you're just a man with an outdated narrative that no longer holds weight, and I'm not the one who's going to back down and let you get away with it." She didn't wait for him to respond, pushing forward again with a fire that only seemed to grow stronger. "You called me a puppet, but I'm not here to read your scripts. I'm here because I believe in something bigger than any of us. I believe in America. I believe in the values that made this country great, and I'm not going to let anyone tell me I'm wrong for standing up for those beliefs. Not you, and certainly not anyone else who's more interested in playing to an elite crowd than doing what's best for the country." The crowd, still caught up in the intensity of her words, began to chant her name, "Karoline, Karoline, Karoline." The sound reverberated through the studio, growing louder with each passing second. Karoline wasn't just defending herself. She was turning the tables, dismantling De Niro's entire argument, and in the process solidifying her place in the conversation. She had gone from being a target to being the one in control, and it was clear that De Niro was struggling to keep up. But Karoline wasn't finished. She had more to say, and now was the time to make sure De Niro felt every word. "I've seen what's happened to America, Robert. I've seen the decline of the middle class, the erosion of values that built this country," she said, stepping closer to the table where De Niro sat. "And I'm not here to play games. I'm not here to pretend that I'm someone I'm not. I'm here to fight for the people who've been forgotten by Washington and Hollywood, the ones who still believe in this country's greatness, the ones who want to see America rise again." She stood there, her eyes burning with conviction, not backing down an inch. De Niro's face, once so smug, now looked almost uncomfortable, his confident posture faltering. He wasn't prepared for this. He had expected an easy victory, but instead, Karoline had flipped the script. De Niro tried to regain his composure, but there was something different in the air now. He was no longer the king of the Hollywood Hill. He was just another man, facing a younger, sharper opponent who wasn't intimidated by his fame or his past. Karoline had used his own arrogance against him, and now the crowd was with her. The MAGA side cheered louder than ever, chanting her name in support. "Karoline! Karoline!" they cried, their voices rising in unison, drowning out the remnants of De Niro's earlier tirade. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the entire studio was on her side. Karoline took a deep breath, letting the energy of the room fuel her next words. "You want to mock me for my faith? You want to say I pray to cover for Trump?" She shook her head, her voice steady but full of resolve. "I pray for strength, Robert, strength to do what's right, to stand up for this country and to face people like you who want to tear it down. And you? What do you pray for? What do you stand for, other than a fading image of a Hollywood tough guy who can't even see the real fight happening right in front of him?" The crowd, almost on the edge of their seats, roared in approval. De Niro, clearly flustered now, couldn't muster a response. Karoline had done what no one thought was possible. She had taken the Hollywood giant down a peg and proven that sometimes it's the younger, more determined voice that carries the truth. De Niro's smirk began to fade as Karoline pressed on. His grip on the chair tightened, his usual confident demeanor cracking in the face of her unwavering resolve. He had expected her to crumble under the pressure of his attacks, but what he had underestimated was her ability to turn his own words against him. De Niro had spent his entire career cultivating an image of the tough guy, the man who didn't back down, the one who had faced down the worst villains on screen. But here, in the real world, in front of millions, it was clear that his age and his Hollywood glory had failed him. Karoline Leavitt wasn't intimidated. Instead, she was using the very things that should have worked in De Niro's favor to chip away at his credibility. "So you think I don't understand failure, Robert?" she asked, her voice rising just enough to challenge him, but not so much that it lost its edge. "You talk about failure, but you've built your career on playing tough guys, characters who always come out on top. But what about your real-life failures? What about The Irishman? $40 million lost. What about the flops, the movies no one remembers? You've had your share of setbacks, Robert. And you know what? No amount of fame or accolades can cover up the fact that you've been playing the same role for far too long. You're out of touch." Her words hit like a punch. The audience could feel it too. The applause that had once belonged to De Niro now felt like it was slipping away. People were starting to realize that this wasn't just an argument between an actress and a politician. It was a battle between two different generations, two different worlds. And in that moment, Karoline wasn't just fighting to defend herself. She was dismantling the very idea that Hollywood had a monopoly on power and influence. She had come to show that the voice of the people, the voice of those who had been ignored by elites for years, mattered more than any actor's monologue. De Niro tried to respond, but the words faltered on his lips. "You want to talk about success?" Karoline pressed on. "Let's talk about success, Robert. You stand up there, in your suits and your mansions, talking about what's wrong with this country, but you've never been one of us. You've never had to worry about making ends meet, paying the bills, fighting to build a future. You've been playing a role, a character that's been crafted for you by the media. But here's the reality. We're done with people who think they can sit in their ivory towers and tell the rest of us what's wrong with our lives." Her words were like daggers, each one piercing the carefully constructed image De Niro had spent years building. The MAGA crowd roared in approval. The room seemed to shake with their support, their chants growing louder and louder. "Karoline! Karoline! Karoline!" they shouted, clapping and standing on their feet. But it wasn't just them. Even those in the studio who had initially supported De Niro were starting to feel the weight of Karoline's arguments. She wasn't just playing politics. She was speaking to something deeper. She was speaking to the frustrations of millions of Americans who had watched Hollywood and the elites tell them how to think, how to vote, and how to live their lives for far too long. Now, here was someone who wasn't playing the game. She was rewriting the rules, and in doing so, she was winning over even the most skeptical. Karoline wasn't about to let up. "You think you know what's best for this country, Robert? You think you're the one who should be telling us what America needs? Look around you. You live in a bubble. You've been surrounded by the same rich and famous people for decades. You've been shielded from the very problems you claim to care about. Meanwhile, we're out here fighting for a future that's slipping away." Her voice was steady, but the intensity in her eyes couldn't be ignored. "And you know what? I'm not just standing here to defend myself. I'm standing here to show that people like you, people who think they can keep us in the dark with their false narratives, are on the wrong side of history." She paused, letting that last line land, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. "You've spent your whole life in Hollywood, but real life isn't scripted. And I'm not here to read from your script. I'm here to make sure the American people know the truth." De Niro shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable, his earlier bravado beginning to slip away. He tried to regain his composure, but it was clear that the audience and the millions watching from home were no longer on his side. Karoline had taken the momentum back, and now it was his turn to respond. But how could he? The arguments he had made earlier were starting to unravel, exposed for what they truly were, attacks without substance, opinions without fact. He had underestimated Karoline Leavitt, and now his words seemed hollow. He tried once more to fire back, to reclaim the narrative, but the words just weren't coming out with the same force. "You're just a puppet," De Niro muttered under his breath, almost to himself, as if repeating it enough times might make it true. But Karoline wasn't having any of it. "Really?" she shot back. "You want to keep calling me a puppet? Let's talk about the real puppet in this room, someone who has spent his entire career playing characters that aren't real, that have no connection to the struggles of everyday people, someone who doesn't understand the real fight. That's the real puppet, Robert." The audience couldn't contain themselves anymore. The laughter and applause grew even louder, drowning out De Niro's feeble attempt to reclaim control. The MAGA side of the room was on their feet now, chanting Karoline's name, chanting victory. De Niro, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, slumped in his chair, unsure of how to recover from the blows he had just taken. The fight had shifted, and it was clear that Karoline Leavitt had come out on top. But she wasn't done. No, Karoline wasn't the type to sit back and let the crowd do all the work. She knew that in this battle, she needed to make sure that no one could ever forget this moment, that it would be etched in the minds of everyone who watched. She leaned forward, her eyes locking with De Niro's, and with one final jab, she sealed the deal. "You want to talk about being real, Robert? Maybe it's time you start living in the real world." The audience erupted into applause, and Karoline stood there, her posture tall and confident. De Niro, now speechless, stared back at her, his earlier arrogance completely dissolved. He had underestimated her, and in doing so, had shown the world that sometimes age and fame weren't enough to win an argument. In this battle it was the truth and the conviction behind it that had triumphed. The fight had been fierce, but it was over, and Karoline had just made it clear she wasn't going anywhere. Karoline's final blow landed with the precision of a master strategist. She had carefully chipped away at De Niro's facade, exposing his arrogance and his disconnection from the real world. But now, as the energy in the room began to shift completely in her favor, she wasn't about to let him recover. The momentum was hers, and she wasn't going to waste it. The applause from the MAGA crowd was deafening, almost overwhelming, as she stepped forward, confident and calm. The once smirking De Niro sat there, visibly shaken, unable to hide his discomfort. His confident posture had crumbled, replaced by a man who was struggling to keep up. Karoline, with her youthful energy and unwavering focus, had outclassed him. She wasn't just defending herself anymore, she was dismantling everything he represented. The Hollywood elite, the self-righteousness, and the idea that experience alone could win the day. Karoline had shown that conviction, belief, and a clear understanding of what was at stake mattered more than any accolade or past glory. "You want to mock me for my faith?" Karoline asked, her voice cutting through the tension. "You think praying to God makes me weak? Let me tell you something, Robert. I don't need your approval. I don't need anyone's approval. My faith gives me strength you couldn't possibly understand, because you've spent your whole life pretending to be something you're not. I'm not hiding behind scripts, behind roles I play. I'm here because I believe in something bigger than myself. I believe in America, in the people who are struggling to survive in a system that has been broken by people like you. You who have built your empire on the backs of those same people, and now you sit up there judging us for trying to fix it." The audience roared in agreement, the chants of "Karoline, Karoline, Karoline," growing louder and louder until it seemed as though the entire studio was vibrating with their support. Karoline wasn't just winning the argument, she was winning the crowd, and that was the moment when it became clear. De Niro had lost. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped expression as he tried, unsuccessfully, to regain his composure. But how could he? The more he tried to deflect, the more Karoline's words seemed to sink in, hitting harder and harder as the seconds passed. The cracks in his defense were undeniable. He had thought he could handle a young press secretary. He had believed his Hollywood legend status would intimidate her into silence, but she had turned the tables. Karoline leaned in slightly, her eyes never leaving De Niro. "You keep calling me a puppet, but here's the truth. I'm not the puppet. You are. You've been dancing to the tune of the elite for years, letting them pull your strings while you play the part of the anti-Trump hero. But the real truth, Robert, is that you've been out of touch with what's really going on in this country. You've lived in your Hollywood bubble, surrounded by wealth, fame, and power. Meanwhile, the rest of us are out here fighting to make America work again, fighting for the future of people who don't get to live in mansions or play characters on screen. The American people see that now. They see you for what you really are, a man who has spent too many years pretending to care, but who's really just in it for himself. And you know what? The American people aren't fooled anymore." The room exploded into applause, the MAGA supporters standing, shouting and clapping. The liberals, though still holding on to their loyalty to De Niro, couldn't ignore the fact that Karoline had managed to land blow after blow, not just against De Niro's argument, but against the very culture that had been built up around him. She had done what many thought was impossible. She had knocked a Hollywood titan off his pedestal, and she had done it with facts, conviction, and an unapologetic willingness to stand firm in the face of adversity. It wasn't just a personal victory, it was a statement to everyone watching that the old ways of thinking, the old power structures, no longer had the same grip on the American people. De Niro, still attempting to salvage the situation, looked like a man who had lost his grip on the narrative. His comeback fell flat, his earlier confidence slipping away as he struggled to find his footing. "You think you know everything," he muttered, his voice losing its earlier bite. "You're just a kid, a pawn in a game much bigger than you." But Karoline wasn't going to let him have the final word. "You think calling me a kid is an insult, Robert? You think that's going to make me doubt myself? It doesn't. You see, the reason I'm standing here is because I know what it means to fight for something real. You spent your life playing roles, but I'm not playing. I'm living this. I'm living in the real world, where people don't care about Hollywood awards or fancy mansions. They care about their families, their futures, and their country. And that's why I'm not going anywhere. You might have your awards and your fame, but I've got the truth, and that's what's going to carry me forward." The crowd erupted in cheers. Karoline had done it. She had completely turned the stage into her own. The roar of applause was deafening now, and even De Niro's most loyal supporters couldn't ignore the fact that his arguments had been shredded, his reputation dented by a younger, more determined force. He had underestimated her, and now the consequences of that miscalculation were clear. Karoline took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as she held the mic in her hand. "You can keep calling me names, Robert," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "But the fact is, we're not here to play games. We're here to fight for a country that's been forgotten by people like you. So you can keep your Oscars and your Hollywood accolades. You can keep your role as the tough guy. But when it comes down to it, we all know who's the real fighter here." She paused, and then, with one last piercing look at De Niro, she delivered the final blow. "You're done, Mr. De Niro." The audience erupted into cheers that shook the studio, some of them standing to their feet, others screaming her name. The tension that had been so thick earlier in the evening had completely dissipated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of victory. Karoline Leavitt had done what no one thought was possible. She had taken down Robert De Niro, on his own turf, with his own words, and with the unwavering belief that the truth was more powerful than any script, any fame, or any reputation. The media storm was immediate. Social media exploded with clips from the debate, with millions of viewers sharing Karoline's final lines and the way she had dismantled De Niro's argument. Hashtags like "How Karoline Wins," "De Niro Flop," and "MAGA Queen" were trending worldwide. Conservative voices hailed her as the future of the movement, while liberal commentators scrambled to defend their idol. But even they had to admit that something had changed. Karoline Leavitt had gone from a young press secretary to a political icon in a single night, and De Niro, the Hollywood legend, had been left to pick up the pieces of his shattered image. As the night wore on, De Niro's team attempted to regain some semblance of control. His camp quickly released statements trying to downplay the moment, but the damage was already done. The clip of Karoline's final line, "You're done, Mr. De Niro," spread like wildfire, cementing her place as the undeniable victor of the debate. It wasn't just a win for her. It was a win for the people who had been silenced for far too long, for the voices that had been drowned out by the elites. And for Robert De Niro, it was a wake-up call. The old guard had been toppled, and the new generation was taking over. Karoline had made her mark, and nothing would ever be the same again.